It's December 1989, and the people of Romania are protesting the eviction of Reverend Laszlo Tokes, the unexpected hero of the Romanian Revolution. Romania's secret police, the Securitate, were there to take Tokes away from his home, to evict him, and make sure that his words would never again reach the ears of the Romanian people. But the people would not have it, and the citizens of Romania refused to back down. They started to yell and sing, "Liberty, liberty, down with Ceaușescu." Little did they know, it would only be merely days before their prayers were answered, and the Ceaușescus stood in front of a judge pleading for mercy and their innocence against their tyrannical crimes against humanity. This is part 2 of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu. I highly suggest going back and listening to the first part before getting into this one. I'm your host, Lauren Powers, and you are listening to Not Your History Class podcast. Our standard education has barely touched upon the depth, violence, and tragedy of human history. My intention with this podcast is to illuminate the parts of our history that have been in the dark for far too long. I want to take a comprehensive dive into our world and to give a different and new perspective on our past. After all, education is our strongest weapon against tyranny. Please note, this podcast contains content and information that may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Please be advised. Perhaps the thing that kept communist Romania afloat during the 70s and 80s was the sensitivity that Romanians had towards foreign domination. Ceaușescu had refused to send troops to quell the rebellion in Czechoslovakia during the 1960s, which spoke to the masses, as they had a leader that would refuse to bow down to Russia overrunning their country once again. The event that likely started the Ceaușescu's hold on Romania was when they went to China in the 1970s and saw how China treated Mao. Henry Kissinger, United States Secretary of State in the 70s, said, quote, "In those days, China was less dry and bureaucratic than Russia. If you were in China, you'd have seen a nation totally focused on one leader. There was an extraordinary impression not only of monolithic power and the authority to enforce your will, but also a sense of reverence in the presence of Mao. People wanted to do what Mao wanted them to do. He was a quasi-religious figure. I can see how a peasant boy and girl would be attracted." End quote. In order to create this almost legendary-like leader in Romania, the Ceaușescus had their words enshrined, legends created. They used Mao's little red book to inspire Nicolae's speeches. People were taken out of work, children out of school, to have these spontaneous displays of love for Nicolae and Elena, all of them in a stadium chanting their love. Elena stated that her husband belonged in the pantheon of the greats and he deserved to be worshipped. Nicolae had no problem believing this propaganda, and he eventually became what could be described as a megalomaniac. A megalomaniac is someone who has highly inflated sense of their powers, capabilities, and importance. My favorite example of this is Gilderoy Lockhart from the Harry Potter series. The trip to China was formative for Elena too. While she initially had very little interest in politics, after seeing the way that Mao was worshipped, she began to insert herself into Romanian politics. She became a member of the Communist Party's Central Committee, and then in 1973 graduated to the Executive Committee. By 1980, she became the first Deputy Prime Minister in the Council of Ministers, which is the second place right after her husband. The honorary credentials she lacked were given complimentary titles. In 1982, on International Women's Day, she was extolled as, quote, "comrade, accommodation, doctor, engineer." Elena Ceaușescu, outstanding activist of party and state, eminent personage of Romanian and international science. End quote. No one could get to the president without her approval, and his workers were afraid to tell him the truth. New York Rabbi Arthur Schneider, who had previously spoken before to Nicolae about human rights and religious freedom, said that, quote, his ministers and diplomats would tell him nothing, end quote. My personal education has roots in behavioral science, and sometimes I like to get into the psychology of why people do what they do. According to an article written by Dr. Ronald Riggio in Psychology Today, that despite the quote, absolute power corrupts absolutely, that power is not going to inherently lead to corruption. Instead, what leads to corruption is the motivation behind gaining power. Powerful people quite simply have better privileges. They can buy themselves out of trouble. They also have the possibility of being able to intimidate those with less power. They can also start to believe that rules and laws don't apply to them. It's easy for them to lose focus and lose the ability to see from others' perspective, which can lead to an exploitation of people who work for them or who they are in charge of. The best remedy for this is humility, for others to point out their mistakes and missteps. With Nicolae's workers too afraid to even tell him the truth, his and Elena's power went virtually unchecked. Elena also managed to use sexual blackmail against members of the nomenklatura, influential members of government. She would have microphones hidden in their hotel rooms and in restaurants. There were some theories that the reason for this intrusion of privacy was that this was her type of pornography. She enjoyed being the voyeur. Others surmise that it was the power that she enjoyed more than the sex. Information she gathered was used to create Nicolae's distrust of his associates, causing him to later replace around 40 members of the government with members of his and her families. As with the feeling of self-importance, megalomania also comes with a healthy side of paranoia. Nicolae was paranoid towards the end of his reign that he was either going to be contaminated or poisoned. There's even a story from the former chief of intelligence, Ion Pacipa, that Fidel Castro once told Nicolae that there was a plot by the CIA to rub the inside of his shoes with a substance that would cause his hair to fall out. Nicolae insisted that his clothes be kept in sealed bags and checked for contamination before being worn. Flowers or gifts given to him were also checked for contamination and sprayed with disinfectant before he received them. They had a taste tester to make sure their food wasn't poisoned before they ate it, and they traveled with their own trusted chef. Elena had complete control over the artistic, cultural, and educational life of Romania for nearly 2 decades. Mircea Racuna, a former member of the foreign ministry, had called Elena's control a, quote, cultural genocide, end quote. She objected to what she didn't understand. In 1989, the president of the Romanian Academy suggested doing something to mark the bicentennial of the French Revolution. She thought he was talking about a revolution taking place in the world at the moment. Quote, why should we help Mitterrand with his revolution? We don't want his revolution around here. End quote. Even when it was explained to her that this was a historical event that happened 2 centuries ago, she said, quote, it's an old one. We don't need it. End quote. She had a similar reaction when the president of the Academy of Political and Social Sciences, Mina Gorgu, suggested that she promote social sciences as well as political. He suggested philosophy. She said, quote, what social sciences? Philosophy? We don't need that at all. You have the speeches of the comrade. That's all the philosophy you need. End quote. Libraries and bookstores could no longer have foreign periodicals or books, but they had to display all 30 volumes of Nicolae Ceaușescu's wit and wisdom in his speeches, and the scientific work that his wife most certainly didn't do, but was credited to her anyway. As I researched these individuals, a Shakespearean quote from Macbeth echoed in my head that I feel fits Elena perfectly. Quote, it is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. End quote. One such building that showed Elena's determination to wipe any sort of historical or cultural significance of Romania's history off the map was the House of the Republic, an enormous, ugly building that started in 1984 as the new headquarters for the Central Committee of the Communist Party. It had 1,000 rooms above ground, 3 levels of tunnels, bunkers, atomic shelters. It cost the nation $1 billion. It was designed to host 1,500 communist elite families. Part of Bucharest was razed to complete this building. 50,000 people lost their homes. Historical churches, monuments, a synagogue, and an ancient monastery on a hill, including the hill itself, were all destroyed to make way for this monstrosity. Architect Mariana Shellac described it as, quote, a cancer developing in the center of town. You will find a balcony in every project of this sort, the leader on the balcony and the people down below, end quote, comparing it to the type of building that Hitler or Stalin might commission to be built. There's also a platform complete with hydraulic elevators that would bring Ceaușescu above the head of the people of Romania, as if to appear from nowhere so he may address the crowds. Elena was eventually the downfall of the Ceaușescus. Her vindictive nature and her tone-deaf politics caused her to convince Nicolae to return home after his trip to Iran in December of 1989. He should have never left Romania if he wanted to survive as its dictator, and with revolution brewing on the horizon, he should have never returned home. The events that started the Romanian Revolution originated in Timișoara with the attempted eviction of Reverend Laszlo Tokes. Quote, in 1989, Laszlo Tokes risked his life to challenge the power of Ceaușescu, one of the most infamous communist dictators in Europe. Despite being unarmed and inexperienced in this confrontation, he possessed 2 superior weapons, an abiding faith in God and the moral conviction that by resisting tyranny, he could make it fall, end quote, said Edith Laver, board member of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. With Tokes' eviction on the horizon, Timișoara erupted in a violent clash. Quote, I did not want to become a revolutionary, but step by step my attitude was radicalized because we had to speak out. He was a Stalinist-type dictator. The Romanian system became more and more cruel. We were under total control by the Securitate, the Romanian Secret Service. Romanian economical life was disastrous, misery and poverty. The church became a center of peaceful opposition. I did not make politics in the church. I only tried to express that we must obey God rather than men. People began to gather around my church when looking out through the windows, my windows at the large crowd. Sincerely, I was frightened of the probable consequences of their brave demonstration. I remember the people began to sing patriotic songs, to shout against the regime, liberty, liberty, down with Ceaușescu. The army was very cruel, very violent. About 50 people were killed in a day. That was the bloodiest day in Timișoara. In a very short time, the demonstrations enlarged into neighboring cities, end quote, said Tokes. The militia and military got involved, using tear gas and water jets to subdue protesters, and the army used tanks and opened fire. State of emergency was called by Nicolae Ceaușescu. On December 22nd, he ordered General Vasile Milea, Minister of National Defense, to shoot demonstrators. Milea refused and committed suicide. Army and militia also refused to shoot protesters. A little after noon, the Ceaușescus fled the Central Committee building by escaping on a helicopter, an aide allegedly holding a gun to the pilot's head. Despite the terrifying situation that the pilot was put in, he managed to pretend that he was having engine failure, and the Ceaușescus were stopped by armed forces at a roadblock. Elena and Nicolae Ceaușescu were taken in by the Securitate in Târgoviște. The revolutionaries were starting to take over the building and considered this a victory for the rebellion. Army was then ordered to support the revolution, preventing further violence. The National Salvation Front Council was formed, which would guide Romania after the revolution and organize free elections. Structures of Ceaușescu's old regime were dismantled. At 11 p.m. that day, an announcement was made from the National Salvation Front Council, also known as CFSN, to Romania, the document requesting the following: institute democracy, dissolve institutions of Ceaușescu's regime, and local branches established to provide local government. The CFSN was originally formed to oppose Ceaușescu and lead Romania to democracy. On December 24th, CFSN decided to try Elena and Nicolae Ceaușescu. The trial lasted less than an hour, had no evidence, and Ceaușescu called it a conspiracy, refusing to speak unless in front of the National Assembly. The next day, December 25th, 1989, in Târgoviște, they were accused of 64,000 deaths during their regime by the Exceptional Military Court, a specialized atonal court. Chief Military Judge Gica Popa had delivered the verdict of guilty after a couple moments of deliberation and ordered an immediate execution. Nicolae shouted, quote, "I have the right to do what I want," end quote. Elena yelled, quote, "Don't tie us up, don't offend us," end quote. They were lined up against the wall and shot before the camera could even be turned on. After their death, one soldier was asked to step forward and shoot the wall so that it could be recorded, and that is the footage that was shown around the world. Nicolae's final request was that he wanted to die by his wife's side. He shouted, quote, "Long live the free and independent Romanian Socialist Republic." They died by each other's side on December 25th, 1989. Their bodies were put into nameless graves, although later their names were added, the two graves separated by a footpath. Petre Roman was then appointed prime minister in the interim by the CFSN. Of Romania before the revolution, Traian Rabeghia, a 19-year-old geology student at the time, had said, quote, "It was war. It was a war zone here. I was shouting, 'Liberty! We are the people, and down with Ceaușescu.' I remember the poverty of the 80s. I remember in Bucharest, the breweries, restaurants, everything was dark. We knew that people living in other countries had more material wealth and were living better. It was clear to me that something would happen, but nobody was really talking about it." End quote. There was a lack of food, heating, and lighting for the citizens, while the Ceaușescus lived in luxury. As many as 1 in 4 people was thought to be working for the Securitate, and the Securitate was also responsible for killing and torturing thousands of dissenters. Ioan Ălescu took over the execution of the Ceaușescus. Things didn't get better right away. In fact, he and former Prime Minister Petre Roman and former Deputy Prime Minister Giulu Vocan Velescu was accused of spreading disinformation via TV appearances and making statements. After Ălescu took over, some sources say 1,100 people were killed in a violent revolt. Firearms were distributed to the population, and due to that, there were numerous shootouts between December 22nd and December 25th. Ălescu was indicted in crimes against humanity in 2019. Although I could not find any information as to whether or not he had been prosecuted, it was likely that the judge threw out the case. Prosecutors in his trial said that his statements increased, quote, "instances of friendly fire, chaotic shooting, and contradictory military orders," end quote. As for Elena and her many accolades, her work was still being cited, and in 2021, Romanian researchers led by Chris Ozai, a psychological and neuroscience researcher in London, and Andrei Dombrava, a senior lecturer and doctor at Alexandru Ioan Cuza University in Iași, called to have her name stripped from almost 24 scientific papers and books. They also want her honorary titles, awards, and her PhD to be revoked. She was barely literate in science and couldn't even recognize formulas given to first-year chemistry students. Elena's biographer, Lavinia Beatty, a professor and historian at the University of Ared, said, Quote, the Ceaușescus never needed money again after Nicolae Ceaușescu was appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1965. All their expenses for food, clothes, and leisure were taken care of. However, the constitutions of communist countries stipulated that citizens had both a right and an obligation to work. As the wife of the most powerful politician in the country, Elena Ceaușescu wanted to portray herself as a role model, worthy of being next to the great political leader, her husband. She wouldn't hear of having just any job. As communism prized science as a force for industrial production, and being an intellectual had also been valued when she had been younger, a job as a scientist would work well with being the first female comrade of the country. End quote. Elena ended up specializing in polymer research in her academic publications. Dumbrava said, quote, it was just a matter of chance before she got her PhD, before she got her Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry. She was an unskilled worker in the institute under the supervision of the person who had most worked on her PhD. End quote. Edward Baer, author of Kiss the Hand You Cannot Bite, The Rise and Fall of the Ceaușescus, said that when he spoke to Mircea Corchove, a scientist at National Institute for Research and Development in Chemistry and Petrochemistry, recalled that, quote, in her new position, it was very difficult to talk to her. She gave orders, she wanted no arguments. It was impossible for him to discover the extent of her knowledge of chemistry, for she never discussed the scientific aspects of the Institute's work, concerning herself only with political and administrative matters. Corchove discovered that she didn't know what a chromatograph was, and didn't recognize the formula for sulfuric acid taught to first-year chemistry students. End quote. On the day that Elena was going to defend her chemistry doctorate, Corchove went to attend, as by law and university tradition, all events are open to the public. But when they got there, the doors were locked and the session had already happened in camera. While Elena had the full resources of Romania behind her, her reputation couldn't have reached internationally without the West publishing her work. Quote, her international fame was supported by forcing Romanian chemists to write papers, some of which were published in international journals, as well as a book that was translated in English and published by Pergamon Press, a widely known British academic publisher, said Chris Osai. She would demand that universities in places such as Washington and New York award her honorary titles. She wanted to have this recognition and respect and be essentially showered with gifts from different countries around the world due to her prestigious status. Dumbrava called it, quote, a childish desire, end quote. The biography BT said that, quote, her first recognitions came from France and the United States before entering the Romanian Academy. Can you excuse the interest of those who did not live in a communist dictatorship and blame only those in the country, or just her? That's not fair, in my opinion. Obviously, everyone knew she was an imposter. Those who gave her titles or pressured others to do so are guilty of having contributed to an intellectual imposture of colossal proportions. Those who took part in the deception were not penalized. Without them, those like Elena Ceaușescu would not have existed as a world-renowned scientist. End quote. Mircea Tordescu from the Polytechnic University of Bucharest Department of Bioresources and Polymer Science was one of the scientists who co-authored papers with Elena between 1984 and 1989. In 2021, he was one of the people trying to have her name retracted from scientific works. Quote, the whole scientific output of this department had to have Elena Ceaușescu as the first author. Because of the orders of the Communist Party, this included all joint projects with researchers from other institutions like me and other colleagues of mine. I knew from the very beginning that all papers resulted from these joint projects would have Elena Ceaușescu as the first author, but I accepted the situation due to the location of the laboratory and also because the projects I participated in involved high-quality scientific research, which offered me the opportunity to learn a lot and gain research expertise. In fact, I believe that she did not even read those works because I very much doubt she had the ability to understand them. I consider that it is a moral issue to correct this." End quote. After Elena's death, a school teacher came forward with one of Elena's report cards showing that Elena had failed nearly all subjects taught in Romanian schools in the early 20th century. Chris Osai said that, quote, "In Romania academia, plagiarism is rampant, as is nepotism. Sloppy science is ubiquitous. Much of it is a consequence of Elena Ceaușescu's nefarious and outsized influence in the 70s and 80s." End quote. As for the Ceaușescu children, Zoya, Valentin, and Nicu, they were detained after the Romanian Revolution and investigated for undermining the national economy. Zoya was questioned again later on, but her charges were cleared in 1996. She passed on in 2006 of lung cancer. Valentin was arrested on December 25th and held in prison for 8 months and then released. According to an article in the Irish Times from 2009, Valentin is living in Romania, keeping away from the public eye and working at an institute of atomic physics. And Nicu, the heir apparent and favorite of the couple, the hard-drinking, hard-gambling son, was sentenced to 20 years in prison after the Romanian Revolution, but he was released in November 1992 due to his poor health. He passed away in September 1996 from liver cirrhosis and viral inflammation of the liver, per the statement from the Vienna General Hospital. Romanians now have such a deep repulsion to the Ceaușescus that they can't even bear to say their names. Elena and Nicolae are referred to as the scientist and the shoemaker. If you are looking for sources for this episode, please check out the show notes. Transcripts and sources will also be on my website, notyourhistoryclasspodcast.com. Hosting, production, and editing is done by Lauren Powers. Theme song is done by Mike Meyers. You can find him on the Mike Show 42 on X. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for a future episode, you can direct message me via social media or email me at notyourhistoryclass@gmail.com.